All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's talk at Google here in the Birmingham office, soon to be Detroit office. We are so fortunate and lucky to have Aaron Foley with us today. He is the newly appointed chief storyteller for the city of Detroit in the mayor's office. Why don't I turn it over to you to give us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Well, I wasn't born in Detroit, but I'm a native Detroiter and was raised in the city, went to school in the city. I always wanted to be a journalist and worked at a couple of places. I was editor of a small magazine here called Black Life, First and Culture, kind of distributed around our Tri-County area here in Metro Detroit, and worked at Team Detroit right before they switched over to GTB. Held other couple of writing posts. You know, I was freelancing, I was writing essays, I was just doing a lot of stuff, and I was really engrossed in talking about Detroit and where Detroit is right now from the perspective of someone who has kind of lived through a lot of things in Detroit. So a lot of things that have been written about Detroit kind of vary in perspective. But there was in my opinion, there wasn't a lot of native voices talking about the city. So I just kind of started doing it.
And it's interesting, Aaron, that you say you weren't born in Detroit. I don't know that I've read anywhere if you've shared where that is. Do you care to share that with us?
I was born in Nuremberg, Germany.
Oh, wow.
So yeah,
wow.
So there's an U.S. Army base there. My parents were in the Army, and that's how I ended up born there. But I didn't learn to speak German or anything. And the year I was born is when the United States changed the laws in '84. I just missed the cutoff where you could have dual citizenship. I unfortunately do not have dual citizenship.
Well, you know, that I was actually going to save this question, but because you said Germany, it's sparking a thought in my mind. You wrote your first book, How to Live in Detroit Without Being a Jackass, right as the idea of gentrification was becoming sort of a social norm conversation. But what's interesting is it's not a new concept. If you can trace it all the way back to actually Germany and Berlin and a couple of other Eastern European cities, that's where the original premise around it became very important to have as a conversation. When I read your first book, I get a lot of tips on Detroit, but I actually see the bigger structure around maybe making this a guidebook for other cities that are going through gentrification right now. So I'm just curious, do you agree with that? Do you think that your first book could become sort of a template for Philly and Oakland and some other cities that are experiencing what Detroit has been going through?
It could be. I think the key thing is that, you know, a book about Detroit, I think, I won't say it can only be written by a Detroiter, but it helps if you have someone who is very familiar with what Detroit was and what direction it's headed in. You know, someone who is not from Philadelphia, someone who's not from Oakland, trying to interpret Oakland for other people who are curious about Oakland, it may not go over as well. I think. Yeah. But then the other part of that too is every city has a very unique story. Every city has its own unique challenges. You know, gentrification in Detroit is going to look a lot different than gentrification in Oakland. It's going to look a lot different than Philadelphia, New York, Austin. It's what you know, what the challenges are and how do you interpret them. So one thing I try to point out is that with Detroit, we are very far away from the kind of gentrification you've seen in Brooklyn, you've seen in Austin, you've seen in San Francisco and whatnot, because the city is so very empty. Right? There's currently about 680,000 people living in Detroit now. The population at its peak was 2 million. So there's about 1.5 million empty spaces in Detroit. So it's kind of hard to gentrify when there are very few places to be pushing people out. But we do have the concern of rising rents and rising cost of living and things like that. So there's a number of things going on. Like I said, I think Detroit has sort of learned the lesson from some of the other cities. So we're trying to head some of these things off at the pass. So that's sort of what makes our story different than, like I said, in Oakland or Philly or anything like that.
Yeah, and funny that we are mentioning all these other cities, but on the cover of the book, you say, "Please do not call us the next Brooklyn." So, can you tell us a little bit about how that kind of, I don't know if "got under your skin" was the word, but I'd love to know more about that.
So, no offense to the New York Timeses or the BuzzFeeds or the Rest in Peace Gawkers or anything like that, who lots of great writers and journalists work for these publications. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like a lot of especially the coastal publications, are always in search of the next Brooklyn and the new Brooklyn, and they've sort of applied that label to New Orleans and Austin and any city that's sort of Cleveland, any city that all of a sudden becomes trendy. You see a lot of hipsters moving to a certain neighborhood, and I spent time in Williamsburg. Like, I know what Williamsburg looks like, and Williamsburg does not look like Detroit. and so I feel strongly that Detroit is just Detroit. We should not be taking on an identity of another city. People are trying to call us the next Silicon Valley, and I feel like Silicon Valley should own that label. Detroit should, and Detroit is evolving too. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we were Motown, we were the Motor City, and things like that. I'm not saying we have to banish these labels or hold on to them so tight, but at the same time, there's a reason why we've identified with these labels. It's because it's something that's natural to us. It's something that we can own and something we can claim. And so when you try to say Detroit is the new Brooklyn, and even Brooklyn, Brooklyn 20 years ago, 40 years ago wasn't the Brooklyn that it is now, what does that say about us?
It is a conundrum for sure. I'm interested too in the process that you use to go through this book, because as I was reading, I know we're talking a lot about the first book, we'll get to the second book in a second. As I was reading this, almost nothing is out of bounds for you, and I love that you have how-to chapters in the book, like how to party like a Detroiter, how to be gay in Detroit, how to be a woman in Detroit, how to raise a child in Detroit. But a couple of those things I have to just point out, they're not things that you are very intimately familiar with. So can you tell us about the process and how you kind of researched things that you're unless you are a parent, I believe you're not. No. And I know you're not a woman. Yeah.
So. I'm not a woman. Some of the titles were a little bit tongue in cheek. I know I'm a guy, and I have no kids, and I'm born a male. But when I wrote how to be a woman in Detroit, I talked about how sometimes women in Detroit can kind of get the short end of the stick sometimes, because Detroit can be a little misogynist at times. I really hate to say it. I mean, that's kind of a strong word, but we can sort of treat our women the wrong way. I think about how there's been a few political scandals in Detroit, and the women always go down as the mistress, and she was the one, all that type of stuff, and not to get too far into it, but I look at the way how women sometimes get demonized sometimes for their actions in Detroit, even no matter what they do, right? Yeah. So it's sort of just a caution as far as here's kind of where we are right now in terms of culture, in terms of attitude. It's a very unfortunate statistic that domestic violence is very prevalent in Detroit, unfortunately. But a lot of that can be tied to a lot of systemic things like unemployment and toxic masculinity and all these types of things that are just kind of intertwined together. So those are some of the things that I talk about. Talking about being a parent in Detroit. It's no secret that the school systems in Detroit have undergone a massive amount of change. The public school system I went to, 15, 16 years ago is not the same as it is now. In fact, in the 3 years since the book came out, there were 2 public school systems. When I was in school, there was 1, then it split off into 2. Now they folded back into 1, so now I have to update the book again.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's right.
There's been so much turmoil in the schools. So again, a lot of people come to Detroit with the idea the cost of living is so affordable, and I can afford to raise a child. I can afford daycare. I can have disposable income. But you know, just a great precaution. You know, the schools may not be up to par. You know, there's a lot of overcrowding. There's a lot of you know, at the time
lack of teachers and resources.
Lack of teachers, at the time when I wrote it, you know, they were dealing with like rats in the schools and all these types of things. And schools are sort of getting better. There's a new superintendent now and all of that, but you know, it's, in my opinion, it might take a whole generation before we start to see, you know, some of the changes that are being implemented now.
Interesting about gender, such a hot topic right now. Do you, this is just your opinion, but do you think that the automotive industry can be somewhat misogynist as well, just because of its origins and its roots all the way back into, you know, the early days of Henry Ford and men really becoming the pioneers behind the automotive industry? Do you see that as a part of the influence of the misogynist culture in Detroit as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there was that report, I don't know if you saw in the it was either the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times, but it was in Chicago, which is why I don't know which paper it was in. But you know, they interviewed, this was like the height of #MeToo, and they interviewed all these female plant workers, and they were just describing the endless amount of abuse and harassment that they were enduring at a plant, a Ford plant out in Chicago. There's no doubt that, you know, it happens across the automotive industry as far as what women have to deal with. But you know, it is sad. You know, there's a lot of things that we have to unlearn, especially as men.
I love that. Things that we have to unlearn as men.
Yeah.
It requires that huge shift in thinking, very much so, yeah.
One thing I talk about a little bit in the book is how when we talk about the concept of unlearning things, a lot of Detroit's population has roots in the South. A lot of Detroit's population were black people that came from the South, and you're coming from the South with this mindset. I'm not talking about in the South in 2018. I'm talking like 100 years back,
right?
Where there was a lot of you know, it was survival by any means necessary, and sometimes that meant you know, the man of the house and the man of the household having a very heavy hand, being very strict, being very, you know, putting women in their place and things like that. There's also a religious aspect to it, as far as, you know, people, you know, believing that the Bible says, you know, man is the head and women submit and all these types of things. And a lot of that came up from the South. I'm not saying it's because of the South, but it came up to the Midwest, you know, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit especially, Bay City, Saginaw, Kalamazoo, all these places where black people sort of landed during the Great Migration. And a lot of that persists today. You can go into a church now and still hear people say, like, you know, man is the head of the household, women submit to the man, and all these types of things. And as Detroit evolves, I hope some of that thinking evolves with it. So
yeah, what you're talking about too there is the notion behind immigration, which we could tie back to gentrification. So I wonder, around the topic of immigration, do you see us being a city that continues to attract people from, not just from the South domestically here in the US, but globally? Do you see city as a global economies of scale city, and we can continue growing so we can get back to that 2 million number?
I would hope so. I mean, it's my firm belief that immigrant populations are not only the backbone of American society, but if you look at a city like Detroit that is so empty, you know, it makes more sense that immigrants can fill these populations, or empty spaces, I'm sorry. Detroit has always been sort of a hub for immigration. People usually think of the Ellis Island story or coming to, you know, your San Franciscos and LAs and things like that. But if you look at, you know, the first wave of the Hungarians, the Italians, the Polish, the French that came here, and then the second wave, you know, the Latino Americans, and then you break that down to the Mexican Americans, the Salvadorans, the Venezuelans, and things like that. And then the Arab American population that we have here coming from Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, all of these places that sort of have a commingling here. Now we have a growing West African population, we have a growing West Indian population. All of these things contribute to what Detroit's culture is. You know, I love the fact that I can go to a Caribbean restaurant. I love the fact that I can go to an African restaurant and a Middle Eastern restaurant, all within, like, you know, a few miles of each other here in Detroit. So yeah, let's bring more immigrants to Detroit.
Let's do that. Let's keep making this city.
I can never forget we have a whole Banglatown now. So
and that actually, in the chapter where you talk about how to be a parent in Detroit, one thing that struck me that I love so much, and I want to hopefully as the chief storyteller for Detroit, you can continue this, is just continue to educate the young people, our children, in other words, as parents, to be open to race, to be open and to, diversity and inclusion at any company, at any school, and any subculture is the most important thing. So has that always been something that you have been keenly aware of, diversity and inclusion, and was it something you were taught as a child?
It was one of those things that you don't realize how much it was taught to you until you get older. So I always went to mostly black schools, growing up in a mostly black city. And, Black History Month was Black History Month, but we talked about Black history all year long. We were reading African American literature all year long and all these types of things, and I didn't realize. I was just like, oh gosh, I didn't have to wait till February to read, The Bluest Eye or anything.
It's just life.
It's just life, and a part of that is, writers like Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou were speaking of urban life that can apply to many different urban cities like Detroit. But also, I think it helps having teachers that, I always credit my English teachers and things like that, who had sort of had that forethought to say, like, hey, these kids are going to go out into the world where here in Detroit, everyone looks like us, but you go out into outside of Detroit, they don't look like us. So let's, instill an appreciation for their culture during the younger years. But as, an underlying theme throughout the book is there's going to be a lot of people who are not black moving to it'll be white, it'll be Asian, it'll be Latino, whoever, coming into one of the few cities in America, one of the few major cities in America that is mostly black. It kind of goes both ways. A lot of black people may not be used to that. A lot of black people, again, growing up in mostly black neighborhoods and growing in mostly black schools, when they see someone that is not like them, they may not know how to react, but vice versa. I think the onus also kind of falls on the newer person. And how do we kind of meet each other in the middle here? I think the end goal is we're all here in Detroit, right? So let's live together, let's understand each other, and let's move the city forward.
Absolutely, I love that. You said even too, just for a baseline as people who grew up in Detroit from all the different parts of Detroit, one of the things that you all do is ask each other what high school you went to.
Yes.
So not as to judge someone or put them in a box, but just to kind of get a frame of reference if you're East Side or if you're West Side. I love that you mentioned that, but do you think that that's something that's specific to Michiganders or Detroiters more so?
I think it's more specific to Detroiters because Troy, for instance, one of the suburbs, you either went to Athens or you went to Troy. It's I have friends from Troy, so I know. But I feel like I won't say all places outside of Detroit, but I feel like a lot of places outside of Detroit, people forget about high school the moment you leave. Yeah. And a lot of people leave their hometowns, and it's just oh, my high school friends on Facebook, I just left them behind or whatever. But here in Detroit, you grow up in the neighborhood that you went to high school in. Sometimes you end up living in the neighborhood after that you went to high school in, and you end up still dialoguing with a lot of people, maybe not in your graduating class, but definitely who were in the same in the building at the same time you were. Yeah. And it's kind of like an unofficial formality. It's just instead of asking where you're from, we can deduce where you're from by asking what high school did you go to, and it's also the fact that Detroit is very large, but it's very small. Yeah. If I go to someone and say oh, you went to Mumford? Do you know so and so? Do you know so and so? Do you know so? This is breaking the ice.
It is. It is. Yeah. Making connections and networking. Yeah. Absolutely. That's so true. You mentioned Facebook, so I have to take a chance to talk to you a little bit about using social media not only to promote yourself, but some of these amazing things you're doing. And I spent some time looking at some of your social media. You do an incredible job with staying above the board. I think that's what it is. You get a lot of comments, especially on your Twitter page, from people who saw you in a TED Talk or saw you do an interview and they maybe disagree with you. How do you find the balance? Because as a parent and a Googler, social media runs through every thread of my day.
It does, yeah.
So how do you personally find the balance with what's right for social media as Aaron Foley, as a person and as now in a big role in the mayor's office?
There's admittedly been a shift since I started working for the mayor's office because one of the things prior to working for the mayor's office, I tried to engage with everyone, right? Even the trolls.
Love them or hate them.
And you got to engage with everyone, and it's like, and I reached the point. I mean, even before social media, like part of my journalism training was you can't convince everybody what's right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be someone who will always disagree, especially if you put your opinion out there. One thing I do appreciate is that people are so passionate about Detroit.
Yeah.
Right? That people, if the smallest thing can set someone off, and that's the good thing. You should have that same kind of passion and energy about everything in Detroit. So I would engage with everyone. I was just like, hey, this is where I'm coming from. Here are some of the facts to back it up, or here are some of the things I've experienced to back this up. And if I always say, if you have a different opinion, state it.
Yeah, I saw you say that.
It.
Great, keep it coming. Yeah, you kind of embrace people's very bad opinions.
After working for the mayor's office, though, you do have to be a little bit more diplomatic, because one of the things I said very early on is that I'm not just representing myself at this point.
Yeah.
Or, you can always put, like, in your Twitter bio or any sort of bio, retweets are not opinions. But when you're representing a local county or state government, right, or a federal government, you just can't, like, you just can't pop off at everybody. So especially if they're a resident of the constituency that you serve. I'm not an elected official, but I am very public. So the last thing I want is to sort of embarrass my colleagues, embarrass the administration, embarrass the city,
Sure.
Everybody's always looking for something to go viral, and I don't want to be the person that gets a headline and says, city official, mouths off on Twitter against poor Detroit resident or something like that. So
What is your social media of choice? Which one do you find yourself as an active consumer mostly?
It's funny. When I sort of pick it based on the audience. So I'm embracing LinkedIn a little bit more. Yeah. I don't post a lot on LinkedIn, but I should start doing that, because I've noticed a lot of professional connections. I mean, that's what LinkedIn is made for, but its interface now is more social and whatnot. So I need to start posting like videos and things like that, and some of the things we're doing at the city. Yeah. Nextdoor. We literally signed up, the team I manage at the city, we signed up for Nextdoor last week. And man, don't get me wrong, it's great, but it's a different world. So you can't dialogue the same on a Nextdoor as you do with a LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. Yeah. I personally love Twitter the most, just because I feel like Twitter is where you can get, and I look at how other city officials and how other people in other cities use Twitter, and it's just like, this is everything you're going to get from me. You're going to get updates for my job. You're going to get my thoughts about a few things. You're also going to get, like, if I want to jump in on a hashtag. I want to live tweet a TV show. I want to post a couple of GIFs. I want to post a couple of inside jokes that only some of my friends will get. Yeah. You can get just a little bit, a sampling of everything on Twitter. Facebook, though, Facebook and Twitter is kind of half and half. Like, Facebook is where I do a lot of, like, the promotion, and I also use Facebook as a community engagement tool sometimes. Yeah. When I'm just trying to gather some thoughts about the city of Detroit, like, hey, what do you guys think about this neighborhood name? Or hey, what do you guys, I saw this. Yeah. Tell me, if you're seeing the same thing. Every media has its different function, but those are the four. Facebook, Twitter. I'm gonna make sure I didn't lose anything, because I can hear our digital and social media manager back at work saying, "But you forgot."
No, that was just a question about you, though, Aaron. So that's good. Going back to the two books, actually. To the process, it's interesting. Your first book was really written by a party of one, whereas your second book, I believe, you had 32 contributors to that one. How did that go? How did you even solicit those stories about those neighborhoods? Tell us a little bit about that.
The publisher put out a call for submissions. I should back up a little bit. So the first book that came out about Detroit through Bell Publishing was a Detroit anthology. The second was mine. But one of the other cities, Cleveland, did a neighborhood guidebook, and I was thinking to myself, oh, Detroit should have a neighborhood guidebook. Why does Cleveland get to go before Detroit? But
we're way cooler.
Yeah, and Detroit has so many different kinds of neighborhoods. One of the things that is pervasive throughout the narrative of Detroit is everything is downtown and then there's nothing outside of downtown. And people in Detroit know that's not true. So I said to myself, why don't we gather as many different voices from across the city, whether they live in the city or not, but just tell me something about this far-flung East Side neighborhood. So tell me something about this far-flung West Side neighborhood, all these places in between the two narratives. Why don't we do it? So we put out a call for submissions and we got a lot. We got a lot and we had to narrow it down. And actually two of the writers said they would want to do a part 2. And I was just like, you guys can handle all of that because it was a...
Wait, do you have an announcement to make today? Are you writing part 2 to that book?
No.
Oh, I was going to say you could break it here first.
I put the bug in my publisher's ear, and she's like, wait, I do have an announcement, though. The second edition of How to Live in Detroit Without Being a Jackass comes out this fall. So
yay!
It's gonna have
you heard it here first, right? Are we first?
Yeah.
Yes, you heard it here first.
So
Yay,
it'll have a new cover and all that, but my publisher said, well, you got to get through this first before you even think about another book. And I'm like, I'm not thinking about another book.
Are you, I love this because this is obviously the Verner's branding that you use, and it stands out. It's so, and I wonder if you know that if you're from outside of Detroit, but are you doing the same branding with your second book?
I don't know. I'm
Still
working with the designer now, and we were like, there's a Karen Dybus, another local author, wrote a book about Better Mate, and it has the Better Mate logo, and so she already took that one.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, maybe it could be Faygo, and I was just like, well, no, why does it have to be another pop? And I was thinking about all these local brands like Motown and Hudson's and like something, again,
Do Motown.
But then people will think it's a book about music, and I don't want them to think that. So
That's true.
So yeah.
But this wasn't a book about soda pop either.
It wasn't.
So
it was. The Verner's cover was when I knew people in Detroit would get it, but I wanted, if it ever got sold, which it ended up doing, it got sold in Ohio and Brooklyn and Chicago and places like that. I wanted, if you were from Michigan or from the Midwest and you were in a bookstore and you saw that, you would immediately know that it's got some sort of Detroit or Midwest connection.
Totally, yeah. Going back to what we were just talking about with the second book, the guidebook, you got tons of submissions. What was one of the best ones, if there's just a quick story, that you couldn't publish? Maybe you could tell us about here today.
One of the ones, honestly, that I couldn't publish was a photo essay. And that was because to print photo on through a small press, and the distributor that we were using at the time and the book press that we were using at the time, it would have cost way more, and we probably would not have gotten that return on investment. But now that the publisher is growing, Belt is growing rapidly. Like every time you look up there, Anne Trubeck, the publisher, is announcing a new book. Now I wonder if there's more funding to actually do more photos and books. But that was something that was like, oh, I wish I could, because a few of the contributors also included photos with their essays, and I kept saying, I really, really wish we could, but like we can't do photos. So
we wish you could too. Maybe part 2 of that book.
I was going to say part 2 will have to, like, if there is one. That's it.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I also read somewhere that you host pub trivia nights. Is there some place that you do that regularly so we can all come and play trivia with you?
Yes. Every Wednesday at 6 o'clock at Firebird Tavern in Greektown. I work with my friend from college is the operations manager for Quizzo, and it is
love Quizzo.
Yeah, and I just love to pretend to be a game show host, and you get to buy people beer and all of that. So it gets really nerdy sometimes. Like, there's a whole team of local trivia writers, right? So they're always talking about like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and I'm not saying that's nerdy, but like they get deep into it, and sometimes like the host will have to get on and like we're like, we know what this means, but some of this is going like above the heads of like the people that just want to play along. So we had to tone it down a little bit, but they also get into a lot of local questions like Red Wings and local history. I was going to say, it'd be
so neat to do a Detroit trivia night
sometime. I'm going to pitch that to Mike like as soon as I get out of here.
Perfect. We would love that. That would be so great. It wasn't shocking to me when I read that you do that, because at least in your first book lends itself a lot to being a neighborhood guidebook like your second book. And then when I read that you host this trivia night, there were so many things I learned. Who knew that the Renson had a movie theater in it? That's crazy. And who knew that there was over 200 different neighborhoods in Detroit? So how do you know so much? I know you're from Detroit, but these smaller things that go back to the research process of your book, was it just a ton of visiting places and research and
A little bit of everything. I was blessed to have a civics teacher in high school. Her name was Miss Wyatt, who subtly taught us a lot about Detroit history in the grander scheme of social studies, and I was just really fascinated by some of the stuff she was saying. She was talking about like how, certain neighborhoods, we're in high school, right? This is stuff that's kind of old hat to anybody over the age of like 45 in Detroit, but like, talking about like how neighborhoods used to be Jewish before they were black, and how all these types of things. I was literally passing by a church on the northwest side yesterday, leaving a community meeting, and I believe it's a Baptist church or a Church of God in Christ, but they still have the stained glass Star of David out front, and it's clearly not a synagogue, but I was just absorbing all of these little bits of information about Detroit. And you go to a party or something like that, and you try to break the ice with someone. And I'm always a nerd about it. I'm just like, did you know that Detroit has this? And they're just looking at me like, what? And I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. Let me just write down everything I know and do some additional research, because I say in the very beginning, I don't know everything. But there's just a lot of stuff. I mean, Detroit is very old. It's more than 300 years old, and it's gone through a lot of different changes. So there's a lot of different things that need to be known. And one of the things I love to say is that, Detroit is truly an American city, but we don't think of Detroit as an American city. We don't have a Liberty Bell or we like. I spent a lot of time in New York this year. And, people are just like, oh, you got to see the 9/11 memorial. You got to see the 9/11. We don't have one of those iconic American history things, but we're very much part of the American story. We're trading post and building sort of the backbone of that economy, the motor city, being the arsenal of democracy, all these types of things where a lot of the American dream and a lot of the American story has played out in Detroit, but we don't get enough credit for it.
Right, absolutely. And you even say this in your book. I think places like the DIA and all these wonderful cultural destinations that we have that I think we take for granted now because we are such a nice immigration melting pot.
I was going to say, like, the DIA does not get enough credit.
No, it doesn't.
Because people, like I said, people think of the big museums, the MoMA and the Guggenheim and things like that, and they're always either in LA or New York, right? No one thinks of any city in between the two biggest cities in the country as having world-class art museums, but the DIA has world-class art.
Yeah, it's similar to the DSO being one of the most spectacular symphony orchestras I have ever been to.
Yeah.
We're just super fortunate. Along those lines, I think you are familiar that we are moving the Google office down to downtown Detroit. Curious, I have to ask this question. Any tips for Googlers? How to move to Detroit without being a jackass Googlers?
Okay. Well, you can use Google.
You can use Google, or you could think of, I know this question gets asked to the mayor's office a lot. The biggest draw right now is getting big companies like Google to come down, move your full operations down. We've seen Microsoft do it recently. We saw Quicken Loans be one of the first to do it several years ago. So anything along those topics?
You've got you got a world around you in Detroit. Everything's gonna, like at LCA, a lot of things are gonna be in walking distance or in some cases the same building. But you're also gonna be close to Mexican Town in Southwest Detroit. Right. So you can take 75 straight down and check out all of the different places down there. If you're feeling going out of the way, there's a couple of like takeout barbecue places along, the Lodge and things, M10 or whatever your preferred term is. It's the Lodge.
Just like McNichols 6 Mile.
Yes. But also, there's a chance to sort of also check out. I'm passionate about neighborhoods, so LCA is right across from Brush Park, which just today the New York Times had the whole slideshow called Detroit Was Crumbling, Now It's Reviving, Here's How. The bulk of that slideshow was in Brush Park, but also near downtown, Indian Village, the Gold Coast neighborhood, Rivertown neighborhood, the River Walk along Jefferson Avenue, the upcoming things that are coming like to Lafayette Park and all of those East Side neighborhoods. If you go further north along Woodward, the North End. The North End is actually where my family settled when they came up north. And the North End has gone through its challenges. A lot of Motown stars live there. and things like that. But over the years, the neighborhood has sort of crumbled a little bit, but it's still a very proud neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's home to a lot of the techno, some of the more cutting edge techno artists here in Detroit, and they do some of these like underground art things over there and things like that. It's also a great place to buy a very cheap house and restore it. So
Yes.
so as sort of development pushes north, New Center on one side, North End on the other, those two areas are probably going to become more popular. But there's always a lot to explore in Detroit. There's no doubt that a lot of neighborhoods have a long way to go, but
Yeah.
things are happening. Things are happening at a very rapid pace. It's still, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next
Yeah.
year. But it's something is going to happen.
Yeah, those are some great tips. So we'll have to make sure we take that list and get that distributed. And then buy your second book since it'll be fall. The two will coincide nicely together. One more thing back to the topic of you, because I mentioned that you were a copywriter at Team Detroit, now GTB.
Yeah.
We're very familiar with that agency. They're one of our stellar partners in the world of what we do here at Google. How did you make the transition out of being, did you work on automotive business there?
Yeah.
Probably 100%. Out of being an automotive copywriter into, and I know there was something in between, but this awesome job you have now as a chief storyteller at the mayor's office.
It was a very twisted path getting to Team Detroit. So.
Oh, wow. Getting there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So. It's one of those. It was sort of the last place I ended up. I thought I would end up, but I was working as an automotive reporter at Ward's Auto, which is a trade publication. It's in Southfield, covering Chrysler. And, I was doing a lot of, I wasn't just writing about the business of Chrysler, I was reviewing a lot of cars. So I was kind of flying all over the place and getting to know all of the automotive reporters across different magazines and things like that. Things at Ward's Auto were going great. Then I got laid off from there.
Yeah.
But before I got laid off from Ward's Auto, I was freelancing for Jalopnik. Jalopnik used to be owned by Gawker, now it's owned by Univision. I was writing about Detroit for Jalopnik, and I sort of built an audience that way. So I used my freelancing chops at Jalopnik to kind of wiggle my way into some other freelancing gigs, and that was keeping me afloat for a while. But I was thinking to myself, I really want a full-time job. So
Yeah.
freelancing is great, talking about Detroit is great, but I kind of miss, going to an office instead of sitting in my PJs, like writing. So I used some of my automotive experience, and I wouldn't say used, but I knew someone at Team Detroit who was working there, and they said they need copywriters. They especially need someone who knows a little bit about automotive. And I said, yeah, I can do that. So I ended up at Team Detroit. But copywriting, while I loved it, I liked, working on the Ford account and things like that. I really missed journalism. So I was still freelancing on the side, kind of moonlighting a little bit. And one of the places I was freelancing for, Black Magazine, their editor's chair opened up. And I was thinking to myself, well, I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna put my hat in the ring and see if I can do this. And I got that job. So I went from journalism to advertising, back to journalism. But then while I was editing at Black, I got a call from the mayor's office because all of the freelancing that I had done, and the book had just come out and all of that, he was reading a lot of it.
Oh, nice. Oh, the mayor read your book. That's so flattering, isn't it?
Yeah. And I was like, oh, well, that's cool.
Yeah.
So
I'll take that call.
Yeah, I'll take it. Chief of staff from the mayor's office called and said, let's have dinner. I want to talk to you about some things. And I'm thinking she's wanting to talk to me about coverage of the city of Detroit for the magazine. I'm just like, oh yeah, I've been waiting for this conversation for a while because I was trying to build the magazine up to have a little bit more of a foothold in Detroit, as much as it did in the suburbs. And she's like, oh no, we want to talk to you about some new things we got going on, and we think you'd be perfect for this job. And I thought about it. I consulted with like my parents, and I was like, oh, I don't want to change jobs again. I just, you know,
just got this editor's job.
and I was laid off before, and it's also during an election year, and I was like, well, what if the mayor doesn't get reelected? What happens then? And all these types of things, and I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna jump and do it.
Great.
You know, you only get one chance to do a job like this. So after many sleepless nights, I took the job, and I came up with the job title myself.
Did you really?
So there's other chief storytellers out there, but there wasn't one in the city of Detroit. And there was only like a few at the time. I Googled it, and I think Microsoft has one, and Delta Airlines has one, but it wasn't a big job title. Now all of a sudden, I don't want to say I like kicked off a trend, but like you're starting to see, I see now like either the job title or storytelling is in the job description. So.
What were they hiring you to do? Were they hiring you to do something very similar?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they needed, the mayor really wanted someone who identified with Detroit and could kind of speak to what's going on in Detroit and kind of communicate. It has an eye for things going on in Detroit, and bring that to our cable channel in our media services department. So that's where I'm housed. Is I'm housed with the staff that puts out public access programming and does the audio visual engineering and things like that. The city has 4 public access channels, so we brought on 2 videographers in addition to the ones that were already hired to produce content relating to the mission that he had asked me to do. So I send the 2 videographers, the 2 writers, and a photographer out to just cover Detroit as if we're a newsroom. So we talk to neighborhood leaders, we talk to business owners, we talk to residents, we talk to churches, nonprofits, all of these different types of things, and try to get a full picture of what's going on in Detroit. So we know there's a lot of stuff going on downtown with the new arena and the Q line and things like that. And we know that there are still some challenges that need to be addressed in the way of poverty, unemployment, and crime. Yeah. But we also see the opportunity to say, hey, let's not forget about, you know, people who. Today we did a story about a woman who's making it her mission to enroll everybody into a block club. So, you know, these sort of small victories along the way is what we also like to talk about in our media services department, and that's how I ended up telling these stories of Detroit.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And, you know, even here at Google, if you're not a self-promoter, you're not really rising to the top. So it's interesting that you've assumed the position of self-promoting Detroit. Not just domestically too, but also it seems like you've done some cool things outside of Michigan even to really get people to pay attention to our great city.
But I am very fortunate that a lot of people are very interested in the Detroit story right now. But I think what's key is, again, having someone that can communicate from a Detroiter's perspective. I think for a very long time, and this is not a knock on anyone, but like a lot of Detroit story was being told by people who were very new to the city, who were very green to the city. And they were telling their perspectives from, you know, I've lived in Detroit for 2 years and I love my life in the last 2 years. And it's just like, well, what about the people that have lived here for like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years? You know, it's very important to have that balance and have the dialogue across the whole city, not just, you know, a handful of people. We
are so fortunate to have you in that position because you bring the credibility of having grown up here. You've held a lot of number of professional and freelance jobs around the city, and you have the right spirit and the right energy. So thank you for representing our city so well, as well as you do. One last question for you, Aaron, and tell us what you can, but mentioning the mayor's office, similar to Team Detroit GTP, they've been a wonderful partner of ours here at Google, a big supporter of us moving downtown. Is there one thing maybe that we don't know about that the mayor's office is doing that's extra special, or maybe something that we can know about that you haven't had a chance to write about yet or really get out there publicly? I
think we talked about it earlier as far as gentrification and whatnot. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that there are a lot of people in city government who are very passionate against making sure gentrification doesn't happen. There's a lot of challenges. You know, you cannot fight the free market, right? But a lot of people don't know that, for example, our housing director has gone to what we call at-risk properties, properties that are at risk of going from a fixed income affordable housing to a market rate building. So he's gone building the building to convince those landlords to remain fixed income or affordable for the next 20, 30, however long the contract is. You have people like our development team, which just hired a former Google employee, who are securing, all of these grants and things like that to try and create more affordable housing. Because we know that, like I said, there's a lot of challenges that have come generation, and we're living with them now. And a lot of people cannot afford to live in a city with Chicago rents or San Francisco rents. So how do we do everything we can on the government side to make sure that Detroit remains affordable to all residents? And that's something, in my opinion, that doesn't get out there enough. The overwhelming fear, and it's a very legitimate fear, don't get me wrong. It's a very legitimate fear of getting pushed out. It's a very legitimate fear of getting gentrified.
It's scary.
Every time a new restaurant opens, like the hairs on people's back of people's necks go up. But I highly encourage people to understand that, like, you have people that are doing everything in their power to make sure that people are leaving Detroit faster than they're coming in, and there may not be somebody ready to take their place. So what do we do to retain and preserve a better quality of life for the Detroiters that are here? A key tenet of that is, creating and preserving affordable housing.
Yeah, absolutely. Housing is very important. And then all the shops that have popped up along Woodward too make it just an incredible place to be right now. It's so exciting.
I really, I'm going to put this out there. It's not true. So there was a report a couple of weeks ago that said H&M is coming. I wouldn't mind if an H&M comes, and I can neither confirm nor deny. However, you know what I would love to see in Detroit?
What?
I was just in New York. I was just in Denver.
Uniqlo. It's my favorite place. I was hoping you were going to say Uniqlo.
Shirt. This is a Uniqlo shirt.
Uniqlo is my favorite store. I'm going to New York tomorrow. It's on my list of things to do.
And they only have like, 5 stores in the country? And I'm just
Can you help us get a Uniqlo here?
That's why I'm putting it out there. So if you guys, use your search engine magic and like tag them in everything. And
All right. Okay. We'll work together on this.
I'll say Detroit is perfect for one because Detroit and Denver are the same size. Like we have the same population, we have the same square footage. And I think about like, Uniqlo is cheap. It's just as cheap as H&M. And I think about like, if we're talking about issues of affordability and things like that, I think about like kids who need school uniforms and kids who need play clothes.
Oh yeah.
Go to Uniqlo downtown.
They sell uniforms there. Yeah, that's a good point. And it's for men, women, kids. It's for everyone. Well, actually, that's a good point. All right, so that's your retail wish list. If you had, gosh, we have so many amazing places to eat, even grocery stores that have retained their heritage. If you had one wish for, not a chain, or it could be a chain, but a type of restaurant that we're missing or we're lacking, what would you like to see in the city?
We are missing a full-scale Indian restaurant.
Okay, all right,
When I say like full-scale, I mean like with a bar, large amount of seating. There's one or two. The one I'm thinking of is mostly takeout. If there's a second one out there, I can't think of what it is right now, but we're missing a full-scale Indian restaurant. What else are we missing? That's the main thing I can think of. I love Indian food, so.
There's, I was just at the adventure park, actually, right along the.
I
love, and that I believe is the Michigan DNR actually sponsors that along the Riverwalk, and it got me to thinking, Belle Isle is one of our favorite places to picnic and go to the aquarium and take a walk and whatever else, and now we've got the adventure park. So, in my opinion, I think we're missing more places like that, places for like big parties or birthday parties or group gatherings, group events. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but that'd be on my wish list.
There's a few, I think of Rouge Park way on the west side, how much outdoor space there is there. I cannot call, Baldock Park. Baldock Park has a few outdoor activities. I cannot think of the name of the park, but it's in Banglatown, I believe, where there's a Gaga ball park. And apparently, like, unless you have little kids, like, nobody knows unless you have kids. And it's like a handball, but on the ground, and it's a new sport that only took off in the last 3 years, and there's video and photos of the mayor playing Gaga, and he's like getting into it. So it's like his sleeves rolled up. I was like, whoa, these are kids. Like, we're starting to see like the parks like turn around for the better. For a long time, the parks were neglected. City didn't have a lot of money and things like that. But we're starting to see an uptick in hopefully getting people outside.
Getting people outside,
There's a few parks near where I live, and I'll be honest, I don't use them as much as I should because I'm a homebody. I like to, but I feel like, okay, I'm a city employee. I should be using the parks as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the move of all of our sports teams. All of our
Yes.
sports teams are downtown now, but then, you know, I love what Detroit has done for the sport of soccer because that Detroit FC team is just on fire right now. It is all the buzz everyone wants to go see.
I don't go to
Football.
the DCFC games, but I really appreciate what they've done to bring more awareness to soccer. You know, we've had interest in MLB coming here, and I don't know, if we're in the running for that, but it would be great if it would be great if we had Major League and DCFC peacefully coexist. I know there's some tension there, but I think about the long term. I think about our areas like Southwest Detroit and Bangletown, where you do have large soccer playing populations. And I played soccer when I was a little kid, and I'm thinking the more soccer we have, the better. Let's get all these kids playing.
Yeah, it is because it is an international game, but we won't show bias towards our favorite sports. But thank you so much, Aaron, for being here today. We really appreciate your time. And if you haven't read his book or either of his books, make sure you check them out, as well as the one that's on its way out now this fall. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.